Welcome back to the Queers and Qualms Podcast. I am one of your hosts. This is Sijara Eubanks, and I've got with me my sister.
Of course, and it's me, Yaz. How's everybody doing on this lovely Sunday? Sundays, which have been our recording days as of recently. It's also our drop days. So we, as of this recording, we just dropped episode 8 that you can find on Spotify. If you haven't already listened, if you have, thanks. Welcome back, everyone.
Hopefully you're binging and you just listened to episode 8 and now you're here for episode 9.
Exactly.
Which we're going to roll right into because in episode 8 is like props therapy. We talked a lot about mental health and self-awareness.
Practices.
Yeah. And this episode we're going to
It kind of bounces off of.
Yeah.
Honestly, we'll be referring a lot to some of the mental health practices because in this episode we're going to be talking about triggers, and a good way of dealing with triggers and coping with triggers is props therapy. So go back and listen to that episode if you haven't already. But yeah,
the letter of the day, kids, is T. We're gonna talk about triggers, traumas, and probably how you need therapy because of them.
Yeah, honestly,
we probably all do.
This is really encouraging me to go online and research actual therapists because I've been saying it for ever how much that I would like to go to therapy, but I just haven't really been able to find I haven't really dedicated the time to finding a good therapist, but I still recommend it. But yeah, as a caveat to the conversation that we're about to have, props therapy.
Therapy. Yeah. Do as we say, not as we do. Therapy is super important. Even though I've at least been to therapy. I unfortunately fall under what most Americans categorize as underinsured or uninsured, so I can't afford therapy usually. Yeah. Even though I'm a professional athlete, which is ironic, but that's for another episode.
So today we're going to be unpacking some triggers, some experiences that may trigger positive or negative emotions, and how a lot of times triggers can be brought out by trauma and traumatic experiences. So we're going to talk a little bit about that and our own experiences, and obviously trigger warning in advance. I'm not sure how deep we're going to get, but if this conversation triggers an emotional response from you, please let us know if you feel comfortable reaching out and wanting to talk about some of the stuff that you've experienced, or if you relate to anything in this episode. Please do let us know. Yeah,
if you're like watching on YouTube or listening on Spotify or Anchor, like we really love listener feedback. Let us know what you love about the episode, what you don't, what triggers you, what grinds your gears. We'll probably get into some heavy stuff, like we said, trigger warning, but then there's lighter triggers too that will probably bounce around. So if there's anything that triggers you, let us know. Maybe this episode triggers you.
Yeah.
Hopefully not in a bad way.
Yeah, maybe it triggers positive emotions. We'll talk about that too. But yeah, to kind of bounce off that, let's just hop right in. Sarj, what triggers? Let's start with some. Let's start with some negative triggers. What are some things, some experiences, some behaviors that you experience externally that trigger some negative responses from just being obviously a Black gay woman? I'm sure there are many.
Really being a Black gay woman, I probably trigger other people so much.
Wow.
I'm actually the trigger as a Black gay.
I never thought about that, but yeah. Explain more for our listeners who may not understand what that means.
Honestly, so I love these episodes because it gives me a chance to research stuff that I never would ahead of the episode. When I look at like what we're talking about, I'm like, oh, let me do some Googling. But it kind of occurred to me that as a Black gay woman, just being alive triggers a lot of people.
Yes.
I feel like just my presence as a masculine presenting Black woman, as a confident presenting Black woman, often being Black, gay, and mask and confident leads people to think like you're mean or bitchy or you just don't belong in this space.
Traumatic, other people's insecurities, your own confidences will oftentimes people will be triggered, and that's like sexuality aside, a lot of people are triggered by confidence in a negative way because they are projecting their own negative feelings about themselves when you
Self-consciousness.
are feeling confident. So that's definitely
I feel like I trigger like weak men just by being alive. I feel like but what are my personal triggers?
Now that we've gotten that out the way.
Now that I am the trigger, we are the trigger. What are some of my own triggers? So I guess we'll start light, because I mean, and it depends on like what triggers you in a relationship or what triggers you in life.
Yeah.
Like I thought about that too.
There's levels.
And then I thought maybe I'm easily triggered, because like I started going down the line of what triggers me. I'm like, that seems like
every little thing triggers me.
Coffee that's too hot is triggering. Coffee that's too cold is triggering. No, on some real triggers. So no, I'll get serious. Like when I first thought lightly, I'm like, okay, waking up too early in the morning, coffee that's way too fucking hot is an honest to God trigger. Like when I go to Dunkin' Donuts, the coffee doesn't have to be that fucking hot. But on like
I'm an iced coffee gal, so
see? But on like some real trigger stuff, like especially if those of you have been listening consistently through the season or who know me personally, like part of me wanting to do this podcast and bond with Yasmin is getting over the abusive relationship I was in for so many years. I was in like I kind of went from back to back abusive relationships, which most people don't believe just by looking at me and how masculine and confident I present myself. They're like, you what, never. But so a lot of me healing from those experiences is recognizing that I'm still triggered by some of those experiences. So most of the time when I think of triggers, I think of relationships first. I think of like like when I first started dating after the relationship I was in with my ex-partner who we have a child together with. Like when I first started dating after that, like there were little triggers that would set me off, like any sign of like jealousy or overt signs of like possessiveness. And because I was so probably traumatized, another key word for the day, I was so traumatized from my last relationship. When I was going into new dating situations and in the new relationship I'm with now, I had to figure out like, am I legitimately triggered because of what I went through, or am I just triggered by every little tiny thing? Yeah. So, but one of the, like my biggest trigger in a relationship is like unnecessary signs of possessiveness and unnecessary signs of jealousy. Like
especially if it's unnecessary. Like if I'm giving you a reason to be jealous, I'm like, oh, okay, like fine, understandable why you would be jealous. But like if it's just like random, it's like, girl, like I'm literally there's no signs of me doing anything but loving and adoring you. I mean, and that also shows a lack of self-confidence in the relationship, which could be a negative part. But I like how you said that. Like for me, triggers are just anything that triggers an emotional response, and it can be positive, it can be negative. Like like we were kind of talking about beforehand, how like positive trigger kind of sounds like people don't say that often because trigger is automatically like a negative connotation. But like I do think that there are things that I've experienced and I've noticed that people that trigger positive responses from me. And so there can be both negative and positive triggers, I think.
I know. I think that's a really good angle to look at it, because I thought triggered. The first thing I thought was like, okay, what scares me? Like like, but it can be. It's triggers conceptually cause and effect.
Anything that causes a strong emotional response. So that's a good trigger. Hot coffee. No.
Like why does it have to be so fucking hot?
Yeah,
but that's not what it's about. Don't get me started on why coffee is so unnecessarily hot.
Because I also have like little petty triggers that I kind of sometimes feel like, when you find yourself kind of exhibiting those behaviors, that like little stuff, you're like, am I just being like petty, or is this really just something that bothers me that I probably should communicate to whoever it is that's showing these behaviors? Like for me personally, I get triggered when I get asked a series of questions. which seems odd, right?
Interview.
So like if you ask me like 3 questions in a row without like, no, it's like if you ask one question and then I answer and then another question and then I answer, I'm like, okay, I can handle that. But like sometimes, especially if you're in like a heated emotional state, or if like you're in an argument, or not even an argument, but like an expressive conversation, and somebody asks me like back to back questions, well, what about this? Well, why don't you do this? And then this, that, and that. I'm like, too much. Triggered. And now my brain just shuts off.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And I think that I'm not directly sure if that relates back to any experiences in my life, or if that's something that I just find to be an inconvenience or annoyance. So, you know, like I'm still kind of finding the line between like what is okay to label as a trigger and what is something that just like bothers me or is annoying. Yeah. You know what I'm saying? And are those things real? Can you call those things triggers? You know what I'm saying? Yeah. Because like, does a strong emotional response of annoyance is what happens when you know that kind of thing happens to me. But if I were to think more like straight line, like, you know, more in the box about what triggers are, I feel like one thing that triggers me is like lack of independence within a relationship. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't have to even be a romantic relationship. It can be any type of relationship. But I don't ever like feeling like I am emotionally or physically codependent on anyone, and vice versa. Like a relationship is two individual people coming together and enjoying and spending their time together. But then it starts, like when it starts to become codependent, it starts to you know, it can become dangerous in some type of way. So that's one thing that I look out for that is a trigger for myself, because I sometimes notice that if I'm feeling like that, it triggers an actual like response, not just an emotion. It actually, like, I start to change the way that I go about in that relationship. So yeah, triggered.
Super true. No, kind of touch back a little bit for me though. Like this idea of a positive trigger is still like. So I'm trying to think of what's an example of a positive trigger, too. Because now I'm intrigued. I'm like, because like there's a way to reframe the way things are in your mind, and like a big buzzword in society and social media now is normalizing. Yeah. So like I'm like, ooh, let's normalize positive triggers. So I'm trying to think like a positive, like maybe I do have positive triggers, like that song I listen to right before I work out. Yeah. Like that could be considered a positive trigger,
if
right?
It triggers a strong emotional response. Yeah. Then yeah, I think so.
We're gonna start normalizing these positive triggers.
Like for me particularly, I'm trying to think of like an example to make it like make a little bit more sense. But like you said, like a song that you might listen to when you're in a bad mood that triggers a happy or like positive response from you can be something like you use like a trigger word or something like that. But then again, you know, we have been socialized to think of triggers as a negative thing anyway. So like when you do say that, it is kind of like, like, what do you mean by that? And that's just kind of how I wanted to think about it in the frame that I kind of put when thinking about certain things. Like, this might have a little bit of overlapping thing to do with like love languages or whatnot, but something that triggers a positive response for me is when people do acts of like people do things for me, especially when they know like I'm struggling or like I'm super busy and I don't have time to do this thing, and then they do it for me and I'm like, oh, like, you know, that triggers like a really exciting, happy response from me. So like if I'm feeling like I'm getting into a rut or I'm unsure of what I need, like maybe the frame of reference is what do I need to do to trigger a positive response to get me out of this rut or whatever it is that I'm in. So like, yeah.
That's an interesting one. I'm also thinking things like prayers, manifestation, meditation, things like that could be positive triggers. Some people who are maybe religious who turn to their favorite verse, or people who are in a good act of kindness from your partner or your mom giving you some words of encouragement could also be like positive triggers. That's fun. Yeah, I like that term.
Just something to think about too, because like I said, most people think about triggers as negative, but it's all about the mindset.
Yeah. So, well, hot coffee triggers me in a negative way. Perfectly tempered coffee sends me is a very positive trigger when it's just the right amount of hot. And not. No,
I'm dead.
My baseline triggers.
No. Yeah.
That's
so
funny.
I want to kind of bring it back on what you said. Really, it took me off guard a little bit when you were talking about yourself as a trigger to other people's emotional responses, which like I never thought about it that way, but it's so true. Mm-hmm. Like in the most obvious thing is, like, we've said it in multiple of these episodes of just being like, triggering a dangerous response from people who feel as though you offended them by existing.
Yeah.
And I've had some of those experiences, and now that I think about it, like, I feel like I trigger people more than I feel like I am triggered. But that just might be because I'm like, I'm a pretty chill, laid back person in general.
Yeah.
But I will say that one of my biggest triggers is men in general, which is like a very large umbrella of things. Because like I say this all the time, I have good men in my life and I know good men, but like based on my experiences, there's way more dangerous, negative energy I get from men than anyone else.
Yeah.
So like, I'm always hesitant when I meet a man that I don't know, especially like a grown man that I don't know. It's always like skepticism based on my experiences of having been like negatively like either talked about or physically put hands on, or somebody or a man feeling like they needed access to something, and etc. So like that it kind of triggers my fight or flight.
Yeah.
In a way that's like based on negative experiences that I've had interacting with men, and a lot of them are men that I don't know, but it kind of, it makes you hesitant to like talk about or even experience these things,
or even live, like, which is a running theme in our podcast. Is one of the reasons we put this podcast together, because we wanted to share the experience, positive and negative, as gay Black women, because and put in that extra caveat of masculine, because the layers of who we are make us the whole, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
the
intersectionality of the different diversities that we carry. And one of the reasons we wanted to do this podcast is if there are other women, other Black women, other women who check all of those layers like us, gay, Black, masc, female, just sometimes just being who we are is an affront to people, and that's one of the reasons we put this together. So it's kind of funny how that all came together. And I think like it's maybe a snowball effect. Like, just being who we are can sometimes trigger other weak-minded or discriminatory people or bigoted people, and then their treatment of us requires or sometimes leads to our own triggered response of fight or flight, and it starts to turn into this like this snowball. It's like, where does it begin? But I mean, I can't help but think it begins with like whoever you are. If you're listening, if you're not, like people should be allowed to be who they want to be. Like, that's and that's it. But unfortunately, we live in a society where just being alive and accepting who you are and expressing yourself leads other people to mistreat you. So a lot of gay Black women are triggered by the presence of men, because a lot of times our presence triggers them to treat us differently, or to approach us, or to encroach themselves upon us. And it that's why it was true. Like, when I thought about it, I was like, what triggers me? And it was like, I don't know, but what triggers me often is when people mistreat me just because I'm me. Right. And that's like the number one trigger. Like, just because you're gay, Black, masculine, female, I'm going to give you a different energy or a different response than I would everyone else. And that already is like, well, now I'm hot. Now I'm ready. Now I'm triggered.
And like you said, a lot of that comes from trauma. A lot of that comes from, and especially being sexuality aside, being a black person,
our triggers the trauma
in America is traumatic and has been forever. Like, you know, from the very beginning of African American like existence, you know, there are instances, there are reasons why black men are so, like, you know, they're triggered by their own traumas of dealing with being a black man in the United States, dealing with racism, and dealing with being exposed to traumatic things that may not even have happened to us, but we see them so often. And that's another thing that I want to pose the question about. We are so exposed to trauma as a society that it affects what we're triggered by. So people say this all the time, that like our generation is so sensitive and so like often triggered by the smallest things, but that's because we have so much exposure to traumatic experiences and events. And even if it hasn't happened to us directly, we see it scrolling through our timeline on a day-to-day basis, which, you know, just because I've never experienced police brutality firsthand doesn't mean that when a police officer pulls me over that I am not triggered. My fight or flight is not triggered, because it is. Right? Because I know that, like, I've been exposed to seeing the effects that someone like a police officer has on black people. And like, so basically what I'm trying to say is that it's all like interchangeable. People are triggered because they have had traumatic experiences or seen traumatic experiences or been exposed in ways that have literally changed the genetics of black people. Like, trauma is in our DNA.
Yeah, and that's new research and new development that's coming out in the last couple of years, is the scientific evidence that trauma can be exposed through DNA and generation.
Passed down generationally.
Yeah, they've had I guess we should find the link. I'm always terrible about putting the links in, but I was reading an article recently that they literally tested lab rats where they would shock one group of rats and not the other one, and then when their babies were born, they would expose the babies would express traumas, like traumatic responses to the trigger, even though they didn't actually experience
that makes
the
sense.
trigger. So like,
when
yeah,
you're
it's
growing a human in your body and you are and you have trauma that.
But even further back than that, think about slavery. Like, you know, no one that's birthed a baby alive right now experienced slavery, but those same like they were saying, like, the same DNA that's passed on, like the color of your hair and the color of your skin, is also like that flight or spite, that same mother nature biological response is passed on, so that you are afraid of the same things other people in your DNA are afraid of, even if you didn't experience that actual thing. And so, like, I'm glad we brought it up, because, you know, a lot of black people nowadays are talking about how we're literally traumatized from slavery and discrimination, even though we didn't live through it, because it's literally in our DNA.
And that makes perfect sense to me.
It kind of does
and
to me,
people are like,
too.
oh, slavery was so long ago, guys, just get over it. Like, it's woven into our DNA.
Yeah. And I think it's a little off topic too, but it got me thinking. I actually had a conversation with someone else recently that's like, okay, so if trauma can be passed on through DNA, and that can be passed on generation to generation, like the fear of whatever it is that's triggering you, I wondered, could other behaviors be passed on through DNA? And so I wondered, could white oppression also be passed on through DNA? Because if a negative behavior can be passed on through generation to generation through DNA, then a positive behavior could, or quote positive, other types of behaviors could also be passed on. So, because sometimes, so hear me out, because sometimes white people be doing stuff that just be like, do you live here, or do you just pop out the womb seriously subconsciously thinking that like white spaces, like white people have a tendency, not all white people, you know, I know we have a mixed diversity of audience members, but there are some white people who I have met who are not who I truly believe are not racist through experience, but literally through their environment and how they were raised.
Yeah.
And they'll be like,
Definitely.
I'm not racist.
It's a learned behavior.
I'm looking right at you
Yeah.
and you're doing the most redneck shit.
Yeah.
Like, trust me. And they're like, what? Me? No. I'm like,
Yeah.
I'm not obligated to explain this to you, but yes, you are.
But the only like thing I can say to combat that in a way is like I truly believe that like obviously racism is learned behavior, and because there are white people who are not racist, but I think that trauma in particular creates such a large emotional response, like such a huge, like it affects, trauma can affect you not only mentally, physically. You can die from shock.
Mm-hmm.
Like you can literally, like it creates such a like response that not only emotionally but physically in your body, that I can understand how trauma in particular can be passed down. But I feel like positive behaviors don't, like, it doesn't, you don't get that same sort of physical or mental like response that you would from a negative traumatic experience. You know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? That's kind of how I thought about it.
Yeah, I get what you're saying. It's definitely a combat. And I feel like definitely like when I was thinking it through, like it came to me, I was like, wait a minute. It's definitely like, it's definitely a real big thought bubble. And I'm still like breaking down. There is no science behind it.
You can learn and you can unlearn, right?
But if you can learn and unlearn, can we unlearn the DNA trauma? If it's in I can't unlearn the color of my hair.
But look, slavery was 400 years long, and to think that like, you know, now we're still going in, like we're still experiencing the effects of it. It's gonna take another 400 plus years to easily unlearn, and even if it is even possible to unput something in your DNA. I mean, we're not scientists here, but like, you know, is that even something that, you know, it took, okay, so slavery was 400 years long in America, right? In the US. And then, you know, it's been about another 100 or so years, right? And we're just now getting the science behind how our DNA has been affected by trauma. It's going to take another 500-600 years of humanity to undo that
easily,
and I don't think we're gonna be alive.
I'm gonna be dead and gone.
I mean, we obviously, but humans, I don't even know if humans are gonna be alive.
No, I mean, humans. Hopefully, I don't want the human race to be exterminated before we figure out racism. Well, oh my God,
we need to figure out the environment.
I mean, look, our rough scientific estimate, I think it'll take twice as long. Because slavery roughly came to America in 1619. It had been around obviously for generations before that. But I'm not a history buff by any terms, but I really enjoy studying history. Yeah. And slavery and colonization is a part of human history. It's been going on since the beginning of human time. As soon as humans could figure out that they could dominate another species, including their own, they got straight to it. So that's what humans have been doing for a long time. Now, the large scale slavery that built America, if you look at America as an empire and not as a country, because if you look out throughout the history of civilization, they were usually empires that would conquer and spread their culture and blah, blah, blah. So if you look at Great Britain as an empire, because they spread, and then they started America. America broke off and started its own empire, quote, air quotes. If you look at America as a country / empire, it's really, really, really young. Yeah, and slavery in this land. So this country was built on genocide and slavery. Yeah. Period. And so if you do genocide and slavery for 400 years, like think about it, even just on the simplest terms as a breakup. They say if you're with someone for a year, it takes like twice as long to get over them. So if we were in like slavery for 400 years, I think it takes clean another 400 just to recognize that that's a thing, educate the entire population on what it is, and then get people past the systematic discrimination that came out of it in order for us to come together as a people and not be racist. Yeah. We got like 300 years left.
And we're talking about chattel slavery right now in the U.S. And then, sure, when that ended 400 years ago, we can't even like talk about we haven't even gotten into the traumatic
Reconstruction, the Jim Crow laws,
prison systems,
school
how
to
slavery
prison
was
pipeline,
legalized, and how that has affected Black families
still in the Constitution
for years and years and years and years.
Redlining.
Even now, redlining, all that stuff. Like, you know, right now, I think I saw something, and I can't say that this was from a credible source, but I say, like, right now, 2-parent households are just starting to become, like, more, since the 60s, 70s, 2-parent households are more than 50% of kids are getting raised in
in a Black
two-family
household.
households. Yeah. That has not been a thing for a very, very, very long time. And you have to notice how that has affected Black women in particular, because a lot of that is Black women raising kids as single moms. And, you know, it's not always the fact that, you know, Black men don't want to raise their kids. We got to get away from that narrative. A lot of the times Black men are not allowed to raise their children based on whatever systemic discriminations or racism that they're going through, whether it is getting arrested for a nonviolent crime and spending tons of time in jail, coming out of jail, not being able to vote or get a job or able to support their family, or whether it's, you know, Black fathers trying to get partial custody of their children and not in the court of law being able to be a full-time caregiver.
Let me tell you something. Shout out to all the Black fathers and other parents who want to be parents. In the court of law is stopping you from doing so. I am one of those people. I haven't seen my daughter in over a year, and because the legal system is allowing my child's mother to keep my child away from me, because I am the Blacker, more masculine parent.
And I'm sure
so
that
shout out to
triggers.
y'all. Stay strong.
I'm
Stay
sure
strong.
that is triggering.
Stay strong.
I'm sure whenever you step into court, you're triggered in a negative way, because I mean, all the stuff, obviously from systemic racism to like learned behaviors to just little stuff in our lives have affected the way that we go about anything. Raising children, being in relationships, working, like how we live our lives. And I guess the question is, how do we as Black people, Black gay women, how do we cope, and how do we not pass on our triggers to the next generation? Like what I mean, and I feel like we let off with this like probs therapy.
Props therapy.
Yeah.
Because I mean,
but then again, Black people are not
that's
afforded the ability to go to therapy a lot of times because of capitalism. Myself, like, okay, therapy, one, is expensive. Two, I think the other thing with therapy, which we touched a little bit on last episode, is one, you're not afforded the availability, because I think America as a whole does not take mental health as seriously when it comes to insurance, and when government loves telling us what to do, except for when it comes to taking care of ourselves. Those should absolutely, not if we wanted, but like, you know, if we were afforded reparations, that should be the first thing on the list.
Yeah. I think
Black people should absolutely have free health care.
Yeah. I think in general, although I don't know if I want no free U.S. health care. I'm okay.
Yeah, that does sound
I don't know.
sketchy.
That sounds ghetto as hell. Time out. I diverge. Hold on. I disagree.
I would like the opportunity,
free,
though.
No, I think
I'd like to be able to.
Nah, I don't want none of y'all free shit. I don't want no free shit from the U.S. because it's a scam.
Yeah, it is.
Because think about it. Welfare is a scam. Free healthcare is a scam. I lived in New York for a year and I was uninsured and I applied for Medicaid in New York. That was one of the only places I was allowed it. That was the most ghetto shit. They will just give you the first raggedy doctor they can find. My doctor under New York Medicaid told me I shouldn't be fighting because I'm a woman when I went in there to go get a physical. He goes, women don't do this. I'm like, if your old ass don't sign that paper and let me go make my money.
Segregation.
Hello? He goes, are you sure you should be doing this? You are supposed to take my temperature and check my blood pressure. Get out of here. Yeah. But
and that's the importance, like sidebar, the importance of community and Black people having their own community, having their own therapists, having their own doctors, having their own economy.
So that's what I was going to go to next. It's not only the affordability of healthcare, but the aversion as far as our society, our culture as Black people. We are generally, especially older Black people, boomers and Generation X, are especially averted to therapy, mostly because we don't see therapists who look like us. We don't see therapists who sound like us. You don't see as many Black therapists, or you don't see when you go for mental health or groups, you don't see that community or inclusion as much, which I think is starting to change. I think this younger generation of millennials and Gen Zers are starting to really embrace the truth that we have generational trauma and trying to actively change that. Yeah. But
and I also think, what would you say?
No, I was going to say, but I don't think the therapists are there yet.
Yeah. Yeah, I think too that our generation is starting to understand the importance of, like I said, community, of like supporting, having not only like your actual family in your corner, but like your friends, and creating healthy environments for which, you know, you can foster healthy relationships, and you know, fixing the relationships with their family members and parents, and like a lot of times checking their parents for their negative behaviors that they're like feeling. You know, I, as a older Gen Z, right, my parents, my dad's a boomer, my mom's a Gen X, right, and like a lot of times, like I'll go to set boundaries and they're like not understanding of that, because then when they were kids, their parents were dealing with, you know, all the traumas of growing up in the 50s and 60s. Mm-hmm. And so they didn't have the opportunity to even recognize that there was trauma. And now we are in a place where, again, this is the good part of exposure. As much as sometimes you're exposed to negative things on social media all the time, we're also exposed to positive things. We're exposed to how to be more self-aware about our experiences and how they're affecting us, and also learning how to communicate, unlearn the negative behaviors and learn the positive ones in order to kind of start to heal as a society.
Yeah. I think a lot of these things that we talk about in this episode, last episode, and some of the other episodes where we've talked about coping and dealing with certain things, like you know, it's just sort of occurring to me as we're talking this out that it seems to be activity, your own activity in your own life sort of helps. Like when it comes to, like, it's one thing, you know, to say, oh, you know, you can do this, that, and the other to cope. But I think when it comes to triggers and mental health and like red flags, when we talked about that a couple of episodes ago, it seems to be our underlying theme is self-awareness. Mm-hmm. Like you have to,
that's the first step.
Yeah. You have to do that. You have to seek help. You have to seek different activities. You have to be aware that you want to change or need to change in some way.
And you're worth doing the work.
So worth it. So worth it. So a lot of it takes activism in your own life. Like you have to be active in your own mental health, active in your own physical health, and just different things like that, because there's no one way to cope with trauma. There's no one way to become healthier mentally. It's just you have to find your own sauce, your own recipe, and start to really look for ways to find the answer in your life. And, you know, and look, I'm up here talking in this mic, but like actively taking care of myself mentally is like a daily chore. Like it's,
you have to do it.
Yeah.
It's not just going to be like, today I'm no longer triggered by that thing, because it just, like, I mean, maybe one day you wake up and you're like, oh, that one thing, but like a lot of the time that's not how it works. So, take the time to really, you know, get
just
to know
like
yourself.
Yeah, you eat right. Like, you know, I'm a big proponent of exercise and how that affects your mental and emotional health all the time. But you have to exercise regularly to have any positive effect from it. I can't just work out one day and lose 10 pounds. Okay, cool. I'm healthy now. No, you have to always eat clean. You have to always you have to change your habits.
Mm-hmm.
And so the same way you can change your habits physically in the morning, you start to change your habits mentally. Like, you know, being just more, expressing more. We talked about internal triggers, just being kinder to yourself when you look in the mirror, when you talk to yourself, think about the kinds of thoughts you have. Like, instead of like, you know, you can't be like, ugh, I'm so triggered by hot coffee. I'm just using that as an example. But like, there are things I can do actively now. I can check the temperature of the coffee before I sip it and put it to my lips, and I'm burned for this
coffee.
You know, I can order. And so that's like a goofy example,
right.
But it is like, you know, I can't just be like, oh, I hate hot coffee and keep going about my life. There are other ways, or I hate fill in the blank, or I don't like such and such about myself. Like, there are ways to actively, for our listeners, like, actively become aware of those things and actively working daily and weekly towards those mental health goals, just like you would any other goal.
Definitely. And I feel like I'm really proud of this generation too, because we have started to understand our worth and really set boundaries. And I see it most explicitly in the job market when I'm scrolling on social media. Like, we are getting away from allowing large businesses and corporations to abuse us as employees. Like, the whole gag about Gen Zers is that, like, they will quit.
They will.
We will quit.
Y'all
we
will quit
because there's too many jobs. There's too many jobs. There's to not, you know, prioritize yourself. Like, you're not, like, we work to be able to live, sure, but, like, you know, work isn't our life. And I feel like, you know, that's just one example of a boundary that we have, as a society, have started to put our foot down.
Mm-hmm.
There's whole there's whole, like, countries now who are working on 3-day or 4-day work weeks with 3-day weekends because people are fed up.
Yeah.
People are now starting to recognize that, you know, our mental health and our lives are important to us, and we should, you know, if working too much triggers you, girl, don't.
I love
and
this
that's
generation.
like, you know, easier said than done, obviously, but, you know.
Girl, don't. I love this generation too, because, like, especially being like I don't know why I think I'm older. Like, you know, I feel like I'm a millennial, but I'm on the old side of the millennial. I was born in 85. Dun, dun, dun. But it's like most of my siblings are either millennial cusp or Gen Z. And it's like, I almost admire, like Gen Zers. Like, there's a part of me that's old and grumpy, like, you know, we did the trigger warning. I'm like, all right, everyone's so easily triggered. You know, the Gen Zers are also
so
like
sensitive.
Everyone has their own. Everyone can have their own label. Everyone can have their own. Everyone can have, like, it's very, very, like, leftist and forward, cool. So that's, like, progressive. I love it very much. But on the flip side too, it's like, okay, well, I don't want to work. Like, and I shouldn't have to. And I have the autonomy of myself and my health to worry about. And I'm like, okay, let's go. I like this generation. Let's move with it. Let's move with it.
Also, jobs be wildin'.
Yo.
They be wildin'. And like I said, there's too many of them out there for you to be out here stressed over work. And we're able to say that as the youngest generation, because a lot of us, you know, we don't have kids yet. You know, we don't have, like, super, super large responsibilities right now. Obviously, like, it's easier to worry about yourself when you don't have a child or someone to support. Mm-hmm. So, but, I mean, now's the time to start making those changes, because maybe our progressivism can help out the other generations. My mom's like, I've been working since I was 13. I was like, you should not have had to do that.
Right.
Like, y'all gave up, the generations before us gave up their youth. And we're forced to, in order to live in this, like, society. And you know, now the next generation is understanding that we don't have to do that. We shouldn't have to. And we're not going to. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, that was a little bit of a sidebar about, like, you know. But, you know, sometimes work does trigger me.
This whole...
Is it working, going to work, driving, triggering.
Oh, traffic.
Driving to work, commuting to work. Like, it's a trigger, and I have to recognize that, and I have to say, what can I do to support my mental health, knowing that I still have to go to work, mm-hmm. but what can I do to combat that? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So
interesting.
that's a
So
big thing.
I thought about it, and literally traffic triggered me so bad in 2008. I quit my job and started doing jujitsu. Ta-da!
Change your life. Triggering.
So that's our advice today. Quit your job. No, just kidding. No, just kidding. We are not professionals. That is the warning.
Yeah, I mean, take all of it with a grain of salt, but we will support you in whatever your endeavor is. So
I totally support chasing your dreams with vigor and intelligence.
Yeah,
I'm all for it.
definitely.
But no, seriously, yeah, like traffic is a major trigger. I used to sit in traffic from, little side note, I used to sit in traffic from, I lived in Baltimore, worked in DC, 2 hours.
Oh,
now no traffic.
Ready to kill somebody, literally.
Yeah, you can get from DC to Baltimore in no traffic. What, 45 minutes?
Yeah, maybe. Yeah.
2 hours in the morning and 2 hours at night. I wanted to find the closest bridge and drive from it. And then I was like 22 years old at the time, 23. I was like, this is how my life, the rest of my life is going to go.
That's where I'm at right now.
I looked over one day and there's like, I looked to my left and I looked to my right and there's like people in their 40s and 50s in their car looking like they hate themselves. I would look around. I'm like, we all hate this. Why are we all here? You hate yourself. You hate yourself. Why are we doing this? Yeah. One day I was like, fuck this job. I'm gonna go roll around in a robe
and hope for the best.
And here we are. Voila.
You know, being able to have open dialogue about it.
Yeah.
I think it's time for Qualm of the Week.
Oh, are we there?
Week. Yeah. Right. Our Qualm of the Week is trauma bonding. I know we talked about triggers and we talked about traumas, and now we have to talk about trauma bonding. So, I don't have an official definition of trauma bonding, but from what I know trauma bonding to be, there's a couple different like definitions of trauma bonding, but when I think about trauma bonding, I think about like two people who have gone through very traumatic events, either together or separately, who then come together and kind of try to either heal from those traumatic experiences or continue to be traumatic towards each other, or have those negative experiences negatively affect their relationship, obviously. So that's like the first kind of trauma bonding. And then there's the trauma bonding where one person is abusing another person, and then they find a bond, like the abuser or the abusee is bonded, it has an emotional bond to or connection to their abuser, right? And so that's another form of trauma bonding. So, or
they're co-abusers,
yeah.
And that's the thing too, that like, I'm kind of an expert in trauma bonding, guys.
do tell us.
As mentioned before, like one thing like I will talk openly about is that I was in such an abusive relationship. And it was actually an abusive relationship before that I'm actually probably more traumatized by. I don't talk about it as much. But I have spent like a fair amount of my adult life in fairly abusive, if not very abusive relationships. And sometimes, especially when it comes to same-sex couples, like we've talked about, I think when people think domestic abuse, they go straight to one person beating the other one up.
Yeah. And
very much relationships can be, especially in same-sex couples, verbally and emotionally abusive.
Definitely.
In both directions. And I could admit that in the relationship that I was in, it was very much like a abusive environment, in a co-abusive. And so that level of trauma bonding, I think, is more like the second definition, where you can have an abuser and abusee and they're bonded in that kind of trauma. You can also have like co-abusiveness and co-bonding in that way too, which I think is sometimes overlooked in discussion.
Yeah. And do you think that like you guys were acting the way that you were based on being triggered from your previous like traumatic and abusive relationships?
Yeah, for sure. I think we were trauma bonded in the way that like I was getting out. I kind of went from the frying pan into the fire around like 2015. I was getting out of one abusive situation, And on my way out, I met the person who would become my now ex-partner. So when I met her, I felt like she was not necessarily my knight in shining armor, but she was like, I was sort of escaping my situation with her. Yeah. And she was also coming out of an abusive situation on her end, and we happened to be coming out of those abusive situations together. Yep. So we came together as in like, let's run away together.
Yeah. Without actually dealing with the trauma that you guys went through. You tried to just like, yeah, like you're stressed over what you're going through something and getting over it. I'm going through something and getting over it. We can get through this together. But it really turned into more so like, I think we carried traumas and triggers over. I think there were times where I probably was very clingy and needing her because I was coming out of a situation where I felt alone and scared, and she was the only person who knew at the time what I went through. I had went through a very abusive relationship with a male at that point, and so she was a woman, and she had also been assaulted by a man in her past, and so we kind of came together in that, like, well, we're not gonna sexually assault each other. so we must have some common ground here. It's just one type of abuse to another, and I think a lot of people do find themselves in situations where they're like, okay, well, at least he's not hitting me. Or at least I'm not being like, at least this, at least that. And it's still not a healthy bond to be having. And just because you've gone through more traumatic experiences previously doesn't mean that this person isn't triggering you in a different way. Yeah. So, and it's just being aware of that. Like, it's one thing to be like aware of, I've gone through trauma and I'm actively working through it. And now I'm ready to be in a relationship where I don't have to, like, where those things I know that I'm working on, and I could communicate, this is what triggers me, this is why it's triggering, this is what happened to me. Like, if you're ready to share that and do that, and that's great. That's different than being like, oh, I've gone through something, but I've not even tried to unpack those feelings, and I'm just trying to distract from my own personal trauma by being in a relationship with someone else. So that's when it becomes dangerous, because not only are you relying on somebody to distract you from your own shit, like, you're also likely bringing in a lot of emotional baggage, and you may not even know why your relationship or your next relationship or any of the relationships in your life are not working, because you're bringing you're bringing baggage that you've not unpacked.
Right. So, right. And that's really important. And look, this is my own little therapy session here. When I'm in a relationship now with a woman, we've been together for about 6 months. Coming into my relationship with her, that was one thing, even before I met her, when I was single and I was like, you know how that feeling, you're like, look, I'm ready for a boo now. Like, I was single for a little while and I'm like, I would like to get back into a relationship, but I want to do it healthier this time. Right. I started working on stuff that when I started dating, when I got back into the dating pool, I used that dating pool time to not unpack, but to start addressing things. Like, I started, when I would be out on dates with women that I wasn't serious with, I'd be like, this person did something that triggered me. Is that because this person is toxic in doing something, or am I triggered by the actual action or the trauma of my past? Yeah. And I wanted to make sure when I got into a relationship that I was more consciously aware of who I am and what I want out of a relationship, and what were my boundaries before even getting into the relationship. It wasn't like I met the girl and was like, now let's start some boundaries. I started setting my own boundaries of what I would not accept or what I could not accept in a relationship before I even started dating again. Yeah. And I think that helped a lot.
Growth.
I'm doing so good now, guys.
No, but I mean, it's a really important conversation to have, especially if you're trying to get into a romantic relationship with someone and you do have trauma in your past. Like I said, there's rarely a woman, a black woman, a black gay woman who has not experienced some type of trauma. So like, obviously being able to talk it out with a professional therapist, if you don't have that opportunity, you know, just being aware of what it is that triggers you and why, and being able to have that conversation with somebody in your life to say that, like, you know, I might need this to be a little bit different because I have some stuff that I'm working through. That's definitely a really positive viewpoint, and a way to kind of avoid those negative trauma bonding experiences where, you know, you're then becoming reliant on somebody to help you unpack, or to, like, you know, ignore it altogether. So.
And there's lots of other ways. If you can't afford therapy or whatever, there are support groups, friends, family communication, journaling, meditation. I'm a huge fan of yoga and exercise. Like, exercise to me doesn't necessarily solve problems, but it can be a stress relief. It can be a way for you to express frustration and emotions in a healthy way. Even if you can't quite get to the core of what it is, you can start to sort of blow off some steam. Yeah, you know,
Definitely. Yeah.
Stuff like that. Oh, so I did a little Googling too. What is trauma bonding?
Okay, let's get an official definition now that we've told you guys what we think about it.
Well, yeah, Google's definition. And also, like, I think there's a few little things in here that are helpful. Where'd it go? Of course, I lost it. Oh, okay. Traumatic bonds are emotional bonds with an individual that arise from a recurring, cyclical pattern of abuse perpetrated by intermittent reinforcement through rewards and punishments. The process of forming trauma bonds is referred to as trauma bonding or traumatic bonding, which is, like, I like Yasmin's definition better.
I was like, that was a lot of words.
But there's a little side-by-side chart, which I think is interesting. Like, trauma bonds versus authentic connection. Now, mind y'all, I'm Googling. Take that for what it is. We are not experts or professionals here. So a trauma bond example would be rescuing, enabling, or saving each other, which, you know, I kind of mentioned, versus an authentic connection, which could be learning, witnessing, and evolving together.
Yeah.
Another trauma bond is
deciding to
work through so these are all, like, good. So look, even just searching on Google and finding ways, like, if you're listening, like, am I in an abusive relationship? Are we trauma bonded? Because also, like, toxicity and trauma and anxiety is also kind of a buzzword now. It's kind of like the hip thing to do is to be, like, emotionally unstable and weird. Really, it's kind of, we have an episode on toxicity and how it's kind of a thing. So these are kind of little clues to look out for if you're like, all right, are we for real trauma bonding, or are we just being goofballs? But stuff like you put the other person's needs before you was on here. One of them says, I betrayed myself and my needs in order to be chosen, versus we honor each other's needs and limits.
There we go.
Versus, you know, stuff like that. So look out for those little flags, and look out for green flags. Look out for, are you and your partner doing some of the more positive, authentic connections? Then you might be in a good relationship.
Like, did I express something that triggered me that my partner did, and they took it and was like, and change their behavior? That's great behavior. You know, that's something to look out for. Have
you experienced anything like that?
Yeah, definitely. I've been in relationships where I've been like it may not have been a trigger, but it's like, this is something that you did that kind of, like, set me off a little bit. Like I'm not saying don't do that, but is there any way that we could work around, like, you know, making that a little bit more comfortable for me? And they were like, oh yeah, sure, whatever. And then I've been in times where I've been like, I really don't like when you do that, and they're like, okay, I'll change, and then they don't. So it's like, you know, you want to look out for that as well. So there's definitely open communication, knowing your own triggers and your own traumas, and what you bring to the table at any point in time is okay, but it's how you deal with that and how you are treating the relationships in your life. So I think that's all we have today for traumas and triggers. Just a quick note, this is the second to last episode of this season, so thanks so much for tuning in for the whole season. We've got one more episode after this one, and then we're gonna go on a little break, but definitely look out for more stuff from us. We're definitely planning on dropping a season 2 where we have a lot of great stuff planned. So keep an eye out on that on Instagram. Subscribe to our website, www.queersandqualms.com, and stay tuned.
Yeah, we got a lot of fun stuff. Season finale is our next episode 10. We do have a lot of exciting projects that we're going to be working on, both together and individually.
Yep.
So, you know, for all of our Eubanks sister fans, like, and supporters, like, we have some projects together and individually that we've got coming up. And we're super excited, and we love the feedback. So, at the end of every episode, I always put a fan question at the bottom and feedback. Let us know, have you experienced trauma bonding? What are some of your triggers, and how do you deal with them? Because that's one of the things we want to do too. We want to bring up the discussion, but let's also explore ways that as a community and as people we can start to address some of the issues that we bring up. So it's one thing to like talk about them. It's, you know, let's start making some action. So if you have any feedback from today's episode, just scroll to the bottom if you're listening on Spotify, or to the comment section on YouTube, and let us know what you think.
Definitely. And with that, we'll see you in 2 weeks for our season finale. Thanks so much, y'all.
Peace.
Reinvention, elevation.
Hey guys, thanks for listening to the Queers and Qualms Podcast. This is one of your hosts, Sijara Eubanks, and there's a favor that I have to ask you guys. Yasmin and I are preparing for Waco Worlds. If you're listeners to the show, you know we're both athletes. I'm a professional mixed martial arts fighter, and Yasmin is a budding, aspiring kickboxing fighter, and she's got a big tournament in Ireland in October of 2022. It's called the Waco World Championships, and we're raising money to help Yasmin get to the Waco Worlds. So if you've enjoyed this podcast today, we'd love some support and donation to help Yasmin get to this World Championships in Ireland in October of 2022. Please donate what you can, $1, $2, and subscribe to our podcast as a monthly donation. Plus, you can write it off in your taxes. It's not a subscription, it's not mandatory, but we do appreciate it, and any donation will help. Thanks, guys, and we'll see you at the Waco Worlds.
So many days and I will wait still. Right now it's clear, it ain't a day level. You gotta get this right now. You gotta let it all out. It's been weighing you down. You've been thinking about this shit all day, all life. You got a long life. You got so many of those. You feel like feline. Ooh, they got them 9 times. Ooh, I got that lifeline. Ooh, I call you up night. Ooh, you got my ringtone. So many days and I will wait still. Right now it's clear, it ain't a day level. You gotta get this right now. You gotta let it all out. It's been weighing you down. You've been thinking about this shit all day, all life. You got a long life. You got so many of those. You feel like feline. Ooh, they got them 9 times. Ooh, I got that lifeline. Ooh, I call you up night. Ooh, you got my ringtone. Reinvention, elevation. No suspension, constant. No stagnant. Flowing like fluid water dragging. Pray to God for blessings and they happen. Baby, you attracted. Now you rubbing on my body, got me acting crazy. Thinking about you, baby, like your accent. Where you from? Who you act with? Thinking about you every day, I'm trapped in. Wow. I'm caught up in your traction. Gravitation, I'll pull out my luck. I'm pulling on your hair from the back. This. Who that tattoo on your back? This. You the only one I give you all this action.